Welcome to Now Let's Talk, the podcast, with Vanessa Corwin and Kathleen Kahn, where we speak with our guests about the joys and challenges of life in today's world.
I'm Vanessa Corwin.
I'm Kathleen Kahn.
The relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine and the European allies is precarious. Russia shows no interest in wanting to end the war. They're hammering Ukraine's infrastructure, leaving many without power. Peace negotiations are going nowhere. What recourse does Ukraine have? Our Ukraine-Russia expert, Professor Alexander Motyl of Rutgers University, breaks it down. Welcome, Alex. Thanks for joining us.
As always, ladies, thank you very much for having me.
First of all, Putin did not weigh in on Trump's actions in Venezuela and his designs on Greenland. So how does this affect the war in Ukraine?
Well, it's first of all, it's a sign of the fact that Putin feels awkward. Trump has caught him, as it were, flat-footed. Venezuela was an ally of the Russians. Greenland, of course, isn't an ally, but nevertheless, America's desires to incorporate Greenland in some fashion or other is, on the one hand, something that Putin would be inclined to criticize, but on the other hand, it actually meets his own desires, because in a way it legitimizes and justifies the seizure of territory by a great power, which immediately has implications for Russia's relationship with Ukraine. So whereas the Venezuela business, I think Putin was cautious simply because he didn't want to annoy his pal Don. There are something resembling negotiations taking place. They're not, they're faux negotiations. They're not real, but be that as it may. And there'd be nothing gained from criticizing American actions in kidnapping Maduro. On the other hand, do keep in mind that Russian propagandists and spokespersons did criticize the U.S. So basically, Putin had it both ways. I mean, he was able to express his criticism of America's actions, but at the same time, not take full responsibility for anything that was stated. But the Greenland business, that coincides with Putin's view of the world. The stronger power has the right to dominate the weaker power. And if the United States can do it vis-a-vis Greenland, why can't Russia do it? Well, it's already doing it vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Absolutely.
So why not Estonia? Why not Finland? Why not Kazakhstan?
There you go.
Or any other place? And it's a green light to the Chinese. I mean, basically, you want Taiwan? It's yours.
My question is, after hearing what you've just said, what are the European allies doing now to support Ukraine? What is the status of the United States aid to Ukraine? Because with everything going on, you don't hear anything about Ukraine again in the news.
Right. Well, it's because everything is going on. There are just so many other competing sources of interest that Ukraine has gone to page 2 or page 3. The U.S. is still providing Ukraine with intelligence information, which is important. But basically, the weaponry and ammunitions have, fallen to zero. On the other hand, the United States is selling weapons, and not with the greatest of enthusiasm, but nevertheless is selling weapons to the Europeans, who in turn are transferring the weapons to the Ukrainians. So if you look at the statistics, the amount that the Europeans are buying is roughly similar to what the US was providing on average. In general, I think the Ukrainians are getting what they need. Certainly what they want. What they need more of, and that's just only recently been forthcoming, is anti-aircraft missiles. And of course, as you know, the Russians are bombing Ukrainian civilians, Ukrainian cities, and of course, Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And it's been, again, the Ukrainians are generally shooting down something like 60 to 70, sometimes 80% But that still means that 20 to 30% of these rockets are coming through. So the Ukrainian commitment is significant. What's been lacking, and Zelensky made a point of this in his speech at Davos, is a commitment on the part of the Europeans to bolster their own security needs. They still, they've increased their spending on NATO, which is good. They've increased their spending on security, which is also good. But their armies are still inadequate. They still don't have a strategy. They're not coordinating their efforts. They haven't taken any bold steps in terms of integrating Ukraine into their defensive strategies. So in that particular respect, the Europeans still have some way to go. On the other hand, keep in mind, they did form the so-called coalition of the willing, which is an effort to bypass the obstructionism of Mr. Orban of Hungary and Mr. Fico of Slovakia. And it's conceivable that this coalition of the willing could eventually become the bedrock or the institutional foundation of an ancillary NATO, an alternative to NATO. I mean, again, it's unclear because we just don't know what's going to happen to NATO. But it does suggest that the Europeans are getting their act together. And in this regard, I mean, Trump, bears most of the responsibility, both in terms of his insistence that they spend more on security, and that was fully justified, but also in his insulting behavior vis-a-vis the Europeans. Basically, what he's done is set fire to the bridges that connect the United States with the European. And unless something is done very quickly, they're going to collapse. And I think it's Trump's desire that they do collapse. Again, we don't know for sure because who the hell knows what the guy is thinking at any particular point in time.
Now, talk to us a bit about these recent internal shakeups in Ukraine and how that's affecting their ability to fight the war, number one. And number two, their relationships with other countries.
Well, you may recall several months ago there was this big scandal concerning misappropriation of funds that were allocated for the military. And interestingly, by the way, news of that and reporting on that has pretty much vanished, not just in the US or Western press, but even in Ukraine. I mean, I try to follow as much as I can. And, 3 months ago, it was headline news, and now no one's really writing about it anymore. So for better or for worse, Zelensky seems to have neutralized that reporting. And of course, it was embarrassing for him because the top ringleader was his friend. So it all kind of suggested that there might be guilt by association, if not indeed by means of behavior. So Zelensky needed to do something. I mean, it seems to be, right? At this point, it's a little premature, but it seems to be a way of making the security issues within Ukraine more cohesive, coherent, and comprehensible. Zelensky fired his chief of staff, a man by the name of Andriy Yermak, who was basically an empire builder. He had his own interests, which may or may not have coincided with Ukraine's, which may or may not have coincided with Zelensky's, or at least that's what his critics argued. Well, this guy was fired. And that was already a sign something, because he was basically Zelensky's right-hand man for the last 5 years. So this was big. But bigger still was the fact that he was replaced by a man called Kirill Budanov, who was the head of Ukraine's military intelligence service, which has been responsible for a whole bunch of targeted attacks on Russian infrastructure, energy. And you may recall there was this fantastic attack launched against a Russian airfield out in Siberia about 3 months ago. The operation was called Spiderweb, and the Ukrainians managed to load a whole bunch of cruise missiles onto trucks, take them several thousand kilometers into Russia, and then fire them on these planes. Well, Budanov was the guy who was responsible for that. And he's young. He's about early 30s, if I'm not mistaken. Very young, very highly respected, very competent, and clearly a security guy. Yermak isn't and never was. So having a security guy like Budanov, who presumably still has his contacts with military intelligence and probably has excellent contacts with military intelligence in other countries, is a way of promoting Ukraine's security interests with its partners in the West. That's a good sign. There is also a new Minister of Defense who's considered to be competent and, again, relatively young. So there is a hope and an expectation that there will now be a more coordinated response in the war.
I'm a little bit confused. Russia hit Ukraine with a nuclear capable missile. But on the other hand, are we saying that Russia is ill equipped on the battlefield?
Well, the fact that they sent that missile, it was called an Oreshnik, and it hit the city of Lviv, apparently sort of missing any important targets, but nevertheless, that seems to have been a reminder, partly to Ukraine, that Russia has a nuclear capacity, but of course the Ukrainians know that. I mean, if anybody knows that, it's the Ukrainians. It's more a reminder, or was a reminder, to the Europeans that they shouldn't mess around too much with these peace negotiations. It came right after the Europeans declared that they would be providing Ukraine with a military presence after a ceasefire was signed. So it was technically, this was a kind of a warning shot. The problem is that Russia's nuclear threats are no longer credible. No one quite believes that they would actually do this. I mean, they seemed credible back in 2022, but nothing happened. Basically, it's saber rattling. Again, we don't know, all right? I mean, who knows what's in Putin's mind? But he's been doing this for the last 4 or 5 years, and each time they've resulted in nothing. So why should this time be any different? He also understands that if he were to engage in a nuclear exchange of some kind, that the United States, even under Trump's leadership, would respond with some degree of military effectiveness. I mean, the threat during the Biden administration was that we would take out some army with conventional weapons, not nuclear weapons. So Putin has to understand that that would certainly be a possibility. Does he want World War III, given the miserable condition of his armed forces? Yeah. That's the other point, right? I mean, what Putin has is a whole bunch of nuclear weapons. And it just goes back to the way in which Russia is often described by people in Washington, D.C., that it's Guinea-Bissau with a nuclear weapon, right? Or is Ghana with a nuclear weapon. It's basically a third world country with a very large nuclear arsenal. And until the Ukrainian war, there was always the belief that Russia also had a strong military. Now we know that the military is, at least to some great degree, incompetent. They've lost 1.2 million soldiers, dead and wounded.
Wow.
They're losing roughly 1,000 soldiers a day, which comes out to about 30,000 a month. And they're recruiting about 30,000 a month. So basically, they're just filling in the gaps that are immediately arising. And there's evidence to suggest that there's a lack of morale. The commanders at the lower level are mistreating their soldiers. In any case, I mean, they're making very incremental advances, very incremental. I mean, it's been less than 1% of Ukrainian territory has been seized, and they're suffering, the adjective that is always used, they're suffering staggering losses. And ultimately, that's unsustainable.
Now, as we've been saying, The Russian army is ill-equipped to fight today's war, with drones, and the Ukrainians seem to excel at that. But because the Russians are bombing the infrastructure and destroying it, how long can Ukraine hold up under this?
Very good question. Well, certainly for the duration of this winter. We're talking about, another month or so. People are adapting. Some are staying within their apartments. And there is occasional electricity. I know of one family in Kiev. They have electricity from 2 in the morning until 7 in the morning. So they've adjusted in the sense that they sleep during the day and do their laundry and do their washing at night. Many people have left the cities, and the mayor of Kiev has said that, he reported that something like 600,000 people have already left Kiev, and he's been telling people that if they can, they should leave the city. So they're coping. Now, of course, they're coping under terrible circumstances. Some people, especially those in high rises, can you imagine you're living on the 15th floor, you have no electricity, no heat, and no water on occasion, and yet somehow or other they survive. They survive mostly because they have to, because the alternative, as many Ukrainians, I think at this point, as most Ukrainians understand, isn't just subjugation, it's pretty much extermination. Putin has made it perfectly clear that he's more than happy to kill Ukrainians, civilians, women, children, old people, men, young, anybody. And he's doing so on a daily basis. That's genocide. This is clearly an intentional attempt to destroy a nation in whole or in part. And that's pretty much the definition of genocide that you find in the UN Genocide Convention. And of course, that also means that when American leaders, talk to him or shake hands with him, they are shaking hands with a genocidal terrorist.
Exactly.
That's really the bottom line. Now, I understand when, you need to talk to leaders, even if they're totally crazy terrorists. But do you need to call them your friend? I wonder about that.
Well, in Davos, the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, said there are more important things than the Nobel Peace Prize. And then he said that Ukraine is our top priority. Do you think that's true?
Well, probably. Well, first of all, why should he be lying?
Yeah.
And this is a respectable individual who understands that he speaks for a huge organization. So I'm inclined to believe him.
Mm.
I would also be inclined to believe him simply because it is, in fact, the case that Ukraine is NATO's priority. It may not be Trump's priority, but it's certainly the priority of most Europeans. Not everybody. I'm not sure how worried Portugal is about Ukraine because it's just so far away.
Yeah.
The Baltic states, the Scandinavians, the Poles, the Germans for sure, the Brits, the French, to a certain degree, the Italians and others. So we're talking about a significant component of NATO that is very much concerned with Ukraine and is very much devoted to helping Ukraine in various ways. So I think he's right. Now, then the question is, and here we're coming back to Zelensky, is their assistance sufficient? Are they sufficiently concerned? Could they be doing more? And the answer to all those questions is probably they're not quite sufficiently concerned. They could be doing more, but at least, compared to where the Europeans were 3 years ago, it's been a sea change, right? Ukraine pretty much didn't exist for Europe until the war began. And then suddenly people started waking up and kind of scratching their heads and saying, you mean there's this place called Ukraine? And maybe it matters. And now everybody understands not only that it's there, but that it matters immensely.
Yes.
Now, also in Davos, Trump signed this document establishing a so-called Board of Peace, which a lot of the European allies did not sign. And Putin was invited to join. Now, this is where the members have to pay $1 billion to be on the board, and Putin said, oh yeah, I'll pay up if the Russian assets held in the West are unfrozen. So what are your thoughts on that, and what does this mean for Ukraine?
Well, personally, I think the whole thing is just a joke,
Okay.
to
Good.
be honest. I mean, with all due respect to Donald Trump, but here's this guy, president of the US, who considers he's God's gift to mankind. And he decides to form something called the Board of Peace with himself as the permanent chairman, as well as the US representative. And from what I read of the charter, he can basically decide everything on his own. And he's extending invitations, some of which have been accepted, some of which have been ignored. It has stellar defenders of peace, such as Belarus, I believe Albania, Saudi Arabia, Egypt are on this. So the whole thing is absurd. And then, of course, the bottom line is, what's the point? What are they supposed to do? Witkoff said at one point, he said something to the effect of, this will be an opportunity for the leaders of the world to come together and share their opinions. Now, if that's the whole point of this institution, to share opinions, then basically what we're talking about is a 3-day, drinking bout where they're just going to be involved. I mean, it will be a repetition of Davos or a repetition of
Oh, God.
the worst kinds of international institutions. And then assume, for the sake of argument, that they all agree, oh, we got to do something about Gaza. Can you really imagine that the Saudis and the Albanians and the Belarusians and whoever, and the Mexicans, if they're on this, will ever agree on what should be done?
Right.
No, of course not. And then even if they were to agree, imagine for the sake of argument that everybody agrees, yes, we should be developing the Gaza Strip, making it into the Riviera. Next question is, great, how do we do it?
Well, Trump, he'll tell you.
That's right. Again, Trump will presumably say, I'll do it on my own, in which case, what's the point of having a board if he's going to do things on his own anyway? Anyway, I'm not just skeptical, I'm deeply dismissive. This seems to be pretty much just another one of Trump's antics, a way of putting himself at center stage of the media and creating something that really is pretty much doomed.
Well, after, I guess, signing this Board of Peace, Trump met with Zelensky and they agreed to a meeting, which I think is happening now.
Yes.
Right? With representatives of Ukraine and Russia and the United Arab Emirates. What's this mean?
Well, again, it means very little because, they've supposedly agreed on 90%. Well, but that's meaningless because the remaining 10% are the key issues. And Russia has made it very clear over and over again, most recently today or yesterday. This is Putin. These are Putin's people. They say very simply, we will not agree to any kind of agreement unless Ukraine agrees to give up territory that it still controls.
Exactly.
And Ukraine simply can't agree to that. No one would agree to that.
Right.
And the Ukrainian position pretty much is, well, if you want this territory, come and get it. And if you're willing, it'll take the Russians about 2 years to get it, maybe 3. And if you're willing to lose another 1 million men in the process, then so be it. Okay. So in any case, the Russians are not just unwilling to compromise, they're actually making excessive demands. The Ukrainians, in contrast, are willing to compromise. They said, we are willing to accept the fact that de facto, not de jure, but de facto, Russia controls these territories. They've even gone so far as to say that we will not try to liberate them using force, which is to say it will only use diplomatic means. So the Ukrainians are basically saying that they are willing to give away these territories in a de facto manner for the foreseeable future. That is an enormous concession.
Yeah.
I mean, they could, if they wanted to, simply say, no way, no how. Unless we get everything back, we're not willing to talk. But the Russians aren't willing to compromise whatsoever. And and as long as Putin is around, I mean, again, I'm firmly of the belief that as long as he's around, nothing, zero, zilch will happen.
Just more lives lost. And
Yes.
yeah, terrible.
What role, if any, do you see non-Western powers like China, Iran, or Saudi Arabia play in the Ukraine conflict going forward?
Well, Iran is pretty much out of the picture. It has its own problems. And if there is a revolution in Iran, which is conceivable despite the crackdown, then that would be another slap in the face of Putin. The Saudis aren't really, I mean, they don't seem to be interested in in playing any kind of role. The Chinese are standing on the sidelines as well, although they're providing the Russians with some assistance, but they're also taking advantage of Russian weakness to buy energy at lower prices. The Chinese could, if they wanted to, they could twist Putin's arm because he's in a position of extreme dependence. He knows, I think he knows, that essentially Russia has become a satellite state of China. And if China wanted to exert pressure on Russia, just as the United States is exerting pressure on the Europeans, it could, and it could do so pretty much successfully. But it hasn't done so, and whether it will, hard to say. Thus far, after 4 years, it hasn't done what it could do. It would be a real feather in China's cap. It would probably get Xi Jinping a Nobel Peace Prize. But thus far, he's resisted that particular temptation.
Going forward, where do you see the war going? I mean, it's at an impasse now, but what do you see going forward?
The president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, today or yesterday said that this notion that Russia is winning is totally crazy. Those aren't exactly his words, but it was to that effect. And he said that in every sense, Russia has been a strategic loser. It's lost Finland, it's lost Sweden, it's lost NATO, it's lost Ukraine, it's lost 1.5 million soldiers. So there's no way that you could argue that Russia is winning. I think there's a way in which you could argue that Ukraine is winning. I mean, not fabulously, obviously, but in as much as it's been able to hold its own, and in as much as it's still around and inflicting enormous losses on the Russians, I think there's a case to be made for Ukrainian victory.
Oh,
but
right.
A genuine victory will require more than just what's going on at present. Stubb said this in his speech. It will require two things: more assistance, military assistance, which technically is perfectly possible. Again, and we're not talking about rocket science here. I mean, it's just a question of more stuff being given the Ukrainians. And at the same time, more economic pressure on the Russians. And there the Europeans can do a lot. They could impose sanctions on those ghost tankers. As the Trump administration has rightly said, they could stop buying oil from the Russians. I mean, there's the American market, there's Venezuela, for heaven's sake. So the Europeans could add economic pressure. Ukraine could provide the military muscle. Again, it might not end the war immediately, but it would create a potentially insuperable problem for Putin. He needs to be able to claim that he's winning. And by any reasonable definition of winning, he ain't. And many Russians know that. His supporters have known that. The various military bloggers have taken him to town for basically losing so many men and gaining very little in exchange. There was a retired general by the name of Ivashov. He had a YouTube presentation, which was widely distributed in Russia a few weeks ago, in which he just castigated Putin for his mistakes and for the ill-conceived manner in which he's been fighting this war. So there is criticism. There probably is opposition. There certainly is dissatisfaction. And if the war goes badly, or even worse than it currently is going, and if the economy begins to suffer even more, it's perfectly possible that Russian elites will say, enough is enough. It's time that you took a long hike off a short pier. I mean, this has happened many times in Russian and Soviet history. And that's happened many times in world history. So why shouldn't it happen again? So I'm
It's positive.
cautiously positive. I was asked this question by a Ukrainian interviewer, and I said, I think there is a 25% chance that Putin might be evicted this year. Now, again, 25% means it's possible, probably not likely, but it's something we should be thinking about, because if it happens, it will have enormous consequences for Russia, for Ukraine, and most importantly, for the war.
Yeah.
And for us, for the West as well, for the world, yeah.
Well, this is an ever-changing, volatile situation, and we'll see what 2026 brings.
Let's just hope for the best.
Thanks for joining us. We'd love to hear from you, so please visit our website at nowletstalkthepodcast.com and send us your comments and questions. We'll see you next time.